It began with a riot of sensation. The Agora was not merely a market, it was a crucible of raw human existence, where the needs and desires of countless people collided into one overwhelming symphony of noise. For the young man, everything that surrounded him felt sharp, immediate, and ultimately unbearable. He moved through the throngs of bodies, his senses overloaded by the sheer volume of life unfolding around him. The shouts of merchants hawking their wares, the relentless clanging of metal as artisans worked their craft, the pungent smell of spices mixed with sweat. It was a constant, uninvited assault on his peace. He walked through this vibrant chaos feeling utterly out of sync, an observer placed too deeply within the mechanics of existence. He noticed how people spoke not merely to communicate facts, but to assert dominance, to draw attention, or to simply vent excess energy. Each interaction felt weighted by unspoken expectation, a subtle pressure that demanded performance and immediate emotional response. This noise was not just auditory. It was a cacophony of unmanaged emotion, an ambient psychological distress that permeated the very stones beneath his feet. He watched strangers haggle over prices, their gestures exaggerated, and their arguments loud. Yet what struck him most deeply was the underlying futility of it all. They seemed to be fighting not for goods or even wealth, but against an internal sense of meaninglessness. Their urgent cries appeared to be desperate attempts to fill a void. He understood that in this marketplace, everyone was perpetually performing, desperately trying to prove their worth, their existence, their importance. It was a display of raw, unrefined being. In the rush of the crowd, he encountered a small disagreement over a misplaced basket of olives. The words exchanged were trivial, a simple misunderstanding of placement or ownership. Yet, for him, it became a disproportionate emotional event. His internal state mirrored the sudden spike of external noise. He felt a surge of defensive frustration bubble up. He found himself arguing more passionately than necessity required, raising his voice with unnecessary fervor, demanding immediate acknowledgement and rectification from a stranger whom he barely knew. The moment escalated quickly, fueled by minor perceived slights and deeply rooted frustrations that had nothing to do with olives. Later, the memory of this outburst followed him like a physical weight. He stood alone near the edge of the crowded square, surveying the retreating figures. The silence achieved in his solitude was not restful, it was accusatory. His immediate reaction, the flare of anger and disproportionate self-defense, felt profoundly alien to him. He saw how easily he had been derailed by a minor friction point. In that brief, regrettable exchange, he had exposed a fundamental vulnerability, the alarming lack of control over his own emotional machinery. He possessed no internal governor. His spirit was merely reactive, susceptible to the slightest provocation or disappointment. The weight of unmastered emotion settled upon him like dust. It taught him, in the most humbling way, that the true conflict was not outside within the clamor of the Agora, but within the fragile boundaries of his own mind. He realized that he spent too much energy reacting to the world, rather than choosing how to interpret it. His thoughts were a tangled mess of instant judgments and defensive narratives built on fear and expectation. If only he could find a way to pause the reflex, to create space between the stimulus and his response. This desperate need for internal silence eventually led him away from the pressing commerce and toward the quiet dignity of the olive grove, seeking not escape, but clarity. The marketplace had been a shock to the system. The sheer force of life, raw and unpredictable, had overwhelmed him. He tried to carry the quiet lessons he learned in the grove back into the bustle of daily life, believing that simply knowing better would make everything okay. But wisdom, he discovered, is not an armor worn for show. It is a practice performed in vulnerability. He sought out a simple conversation with his friend. The discussion was meant to be light, a passing exchange about the season or a local rumor. Yet, as the words were exchanged, something frayed inside him. A minor disagreement over a trivial point, the perceived inaccuracy of a measurement, perhaps, or a forgotten detail about family history, snapped the fragile thread of his control. The anger did not come with warning. It flared up suddenly and hot, fueled by frustration that he was failing to be the man he aspired to be. He felt a sudden, desperate need to prove his mental fortitude, to defend his intellectual understanding in a way that eclipsed mere argument. He spoke too sharply. His voice carried an uncontrolled edge of exasperation. The words, intended only to clarify or correct, were instead weaponized by his own poorly governed emotions. He watched the momentary shift in his friend's face, not anger, but simply surprise, followed by a gradual cooling that registered as disappointment. The sudden vacuum of consequence was far heavier than the outburst itself. It hammered him back into recognition. Here he was again, stumbling over the same familiar rocks of internal chaos. The discipline he had started to build felt like smoke in a strong wind, easily dispersed and painfully visible. He realized that knowing the philosophy did nothing if he did not master the immediate moment. Knowing the theory of detachment was worthless when confronted with the intensely personal sting of intellectual disagreement. He could categorize what was outside his control, but he had failed to govern the internal landscape built by those very emotions. The defensiveness, the need to be right, the desperate craving for validation. He stumbled back from the conversation, feeling not merely embarrassed, but fundamentally flawed in his execution of self-mastery. The weight of unmastered emotion was far heavier than he had anticipated. It pressed down on him with the oppressive reality of poor character, a reminder that thought divorced from action is only decoration. He needed time to disentangle the concept of understanding from the lived experience of being understood or misunderstood. He could analyze why arguing over such a trifle was wrong, but he could not yet make his body and voice follow that analysis when provoked by another human being. The philosopher's words echoed in the sudden quiet. Focus on your judgments, separate fact from feeling. But this philosophy demanded more than just observation. It required intervention into the very moment of emotional impulse. It demanded a continuous wrestling with self that was exhausting and repetitive. He walked away again, leaving the failed exchange behind him. The weight was not simply one of failing his friend, but of failing himself, failing the arduous commitment to inner tranquility. He sat down under the shadow of an ancient olive tree, the wood gnarled and silent, forcing him to confront a simple truth. That even after learning the language of philosophy, the hardest subject remained the most immediate, raw self. The journey was not intellectual. It was visceral, fought out between the reasoned mind and the impulsive heart. The noise of the Agora had been a brutal education. It was a place designed to distract and overwhelm, a sensory assault that mirrored the instability of human emotion itself. Having retreated from the clanging chaos, seeking refuge in the shadow of ancient olive trees, the young man finally found a pause. This grove felt like an unintended sanctuary, removed from the urgent demands of commerce and polite society. He wandered among the gnarled trunks, their roots gripping the earth like metaphors for persistence. It was here, not amidst forced contemplation or rigid doctrine, but in sheer silence that true observation began. The air smelled of dust, salt, and the deep, earthy perfume of the olive leaves, a fragrance that seemed to slow the frantic rhythm of his heart. The old philosopher, who had watched him from a sheltered bench, did not speak immediately. His presence was subtle, a gravity in the quietude rather than an explicit instruction. He merely existed within the scene, embodying a profound indifference to the rush around them, an active stillness that felt deeply foreign and necessary all at once. The silence itself became the initial lesson. For so long, he had viewed silence as merely the absence of sound, something to be filled by dialogue or activity. Now, he realized it was a substance unto itself, a neutral ground upon which unfiltered thought could finally take root. It demanded nothing and offered everything. His mind, accustomed to reacting, to arguing, to justifying, to needing external validation, found itself adrift in this vacuum of sound. He started merely watching the patterns, how the sunlight fractured through the leaves, creating shifting mosaics on the ground, how a bee traversed the air with seemingly effortless purpose, how an olive branch drooped, weighted by gravity. These observations were not passive entertainment. They demanded intellectual engagement. To truly observe meant to strip away the narrative overlay, the judging thoughts that immediately categorize things as good or bad, worthy or worthless. He found himself mentally reciting this process. What is perceived versus how it is judged? The old man finally broke the quiet with a simple question, not directed at him, but seemingly into the expanse of the grove itself. It was about perception. It suggested that many of his internal conflicts were rooted in an overly complex relationship between event and interpretation. The philosopher began to guide his focus away from what happened around them, the wandering goats, the distant shouts, and toward the mechanics of judgment itself. He pointed out a pigeon taking flight. The bird moved. This was a pure fact. But his initial, instinctive thought might have been, alas, it is messy. Its path is uncontrolled. The lesson was precise and brutal in its simplicity, separating these two streams of reality. One stream is the raw sensory input, the feather beat against the wind, the gray muscle flexing. The second is the judgment placed upon it. This shows wildness. This is chaotic. He spent hours doing nothing dramatic, merely observing, which was perhaps more exhausting than any argument. He had to unhook his mind from its lifelong habit of attaching meaning and consequence. A passing child's laughter was not just sound. It was a spontaneous expulsion of joy. The laughter was the fact, attributing it to deep familial happiness or fleeting, superficial glee was adding judgment. The depth of this mental labor began to reveal the true weight of his emotional outbursts back in the marketplace. His rage over a minor disagreement had never been about the other person's words at all. It had been about how those words challenged his internal narrative, making him feel exposed, inadequate, or misunderstood. The conflict was therefore not external. It was a poorly managed confrontation with his own assumptions. The philosopher understood this inherent human flaw better than he did. He was teaching the young man that control was never found in changing the world's noise, but only in altering the internal machinery of response. It is an architectural project of the mind, built brick by mindful breath upon mindful breath. This process felt revolutionary because it suggested a monumental burden, self-awareness. To constantly monitor one's judgment, to catch the automatic narrative that leaps into place and refuses correction, requires constant effort. It is exhausting. It is uncomfortable. It feels like admitting that for years he has been living wrapped in layers of unnecessary assumption. The olive grove became a testing ground for his intellectual discipline. He learned to view discomfort not as a signal for retreat, but as the very frontier of growth. The temptation to argue with the silence, to fill it with anxious chatter or philosophical treatises, was constant. Each time he resisted, forcing himself into pure reception, just receiving the sunlight, just feeling the cool earth beneath his sandals. He felt a small shift within his chest, a barely perceptible widening of space. The greatest realization was that suffering is not caused by external events. It is catalyzed when we insist that reality must conform to our expectations. We demand predictable kindness, flawless performance, and linear understanding from a world inherently messy, random, and indifferent to our desires. The Grove taught him the liberating truth, acceptance of necessity. To say yes to what simply is, without demanding that it be better or different. This mental recalibration, this slow withdrawal of judgmental energy, was nothing short of redefining his relationship with reality itself. He began to feel a quiet confidence, not the booming bravado of victory, but the steady resilience of deep roots, quietly drawing strength from the fertile darkness beneath the olive soil. The lessons of the Grove had taught him much about stillness. He learned that observing a thing was easy, accepting it was far harder. But even in profound silence, the mind remained restless. It craved certainty and resisted ambiguity. Today, the philosopher steered his gaze away from the external world entirely. The subject now became judgment itself. The lesson was simple, yet revolutionary, the distinction between fact and feeling. He watched the philosopher demonstrating this with utmost care, presenting an everyday scene, a simple flight of birds against a blue sky. When one pigeon suddenly landed near their feet, the urge to react was immediate and visceral. It felt like a small, perfect interruption in their contemplation. The philosopher did not comment on the event. He simply waited for his student's reaction. He guided his attention away from the inherent meaning of the pigeon landing, that it meant movement, that it meant life, that it represented an interruption. Instead, the instruction was to describe only what was present, stripping away all interpretive layers. What did he see? A gray bird. It moved from air to solid ground. Its weight settled on dust, nothing more. The young man practiced this brutal intellectual exercise. He focused intently. When a breeze stirred the olive leaves, his mind screamed out judgments. The wind is harsh, or this grove is cooling. He had to forcibly pull back, forcing himself instead to note the physical action. The leaf bent toward the ground. The air moved past my skin. It was exhausting, this discipline of pure observation. His previous emotional outbursts, he began to understand, were not responses to external malice or overwhelming chaos. They were merely cascading failures of internal description. He reacted to his own preloaded narratives. When someone angered him in the Agora, it was not the insulting words themselves that hurt. It was the sudden catastrophic judgment. This person does not respect me. The accusation was a narrative layer built upon the simple fact of a spoken phrase. The philosopher pressed this point relentlessly. Think of the purest existence, the bare bones of reality. If all we strip away are our interpretations, what remains? Only neutral data, only facts. This principle struck him with the weight of physical certainty. He spent hours mentally re-evaluating past failures. The time he shouted at his rival, it was not because the man genuinely wronged him, but because he had judged the encounter as an existential threat to his own pride. The feeling, the deep flush of humiliation and rage, was merely the emotional byproduct of that faulty internal judgment. He realized that life, stripped down to its bare sensory inputs, was mostly quite unremarkable. The struggle lay not in surviving misfortune, but in mastering the invisible architecture of the mind. This discipline required him to constantly question his own immediate reactions, to pause between a stimulus and the judgment attached to it, to insert space into the time when he felt himself rising toward anger or despair. The ancient wisdom was profoundly disruptive. It dismantled the comforting lie that certain things simply should be. He started treating every assumption, every expectation, as a hypothesis demanding immediate proof. This constant self-monitoring became his new default state, replacing reactive emotion with deliberate inquiry. He was learning to become an impartial observer of his own consciousness, accepting that much of human turmoil is merely the collateral damage of poor internal filing systems, of unmet expectations regarding how the world ought to behave. The wind was a powerful thing. It arrived without warning, an uninvited force that swept through the olive grove and across the dusty plains outside. Earlier lessons had taught him to observe facts, the leaf falling, the pigeon landing, but they had not prepared him for the sheer brute power of necessity. He remembered the philosopher speaking of external forces, the tide that pulls away from the shore, the strong current that sweeps a boat off course, or this sudden gust of wind capable of stripping bare a branch. These were things entirely outside the boundaries of his will. They simply were. The difficulty was not in accepting their existence, but in resisting the internal urge to control them, to demand they behave according to his convenience or expectation. He had lived so long by attempting to impose order on people and situations, assuming that if he just argued hard enough or planned meticulously enough, things would align themselves perfectly for him. Now, the philosopher was dismantling that entire structure of assumption. He saw that much of his suffering did not come from the random malice of others, nor even from unfortunate accidents, but from his own fervent insistence that reality owed him a certain predictable comfort. He had built an emotional life around these unmet expectations, the expectation that people would understand him without explanation, the expectation that conversation would flow smoothly and remain favorable to his viewpoint, or that effort expended would always yield proportional reward. This constant cognitive resistance was exhausting. It was like trying to hold back a powerful river with cupped hands. Eventually, the tension in his arms gave out, leaving him depleted and breathless. The philosopher did not lecture on self-help techniques. He presented fundamental physics of existence. He pointed to the shifting light across the rocks, pointing out how it could not be compelled to stay put. This was the illusion most people clung to, the comfort that if they just thought hard enough about a problem, or argued persuasively enough to change minds, they could somehow bend the world to their desires. But this insistence on personal control over uncontrollable elements was the greatest source of human misery. He began to understand a profound distinction. There are things that belong to our inner circle, our judgments, our intentions, and how we choose to respond when struck by fortune. And then there are everything else. The outcome of an argument, another person's mood, the economy of the city, or indeed, the specific timing of fate itself. These were all gifts from necessity, indifferent to his liking. The resistance he had been generating against these external facts was not noble defiance. It was merely friction. And friction generates heat, and heat burns. His former emotional eruptions were nothing more than attempts to will favorable conditions into being through force of will, an internal energy wasted on impossible demands. He learned that true freedom was found not by mastering the world, but by gently relinquishing his grip upon the illusion of mastery itself. This required a radical mental rewiring, moving from asking what should be to calmly accepting what is. It was an intellectual surrender that felt more frightening than any emotional outburst he had experienced before. He realized that this quiet acceptance, This willingness to accept necessity as just another texture of life's fabric was not resignation in the weak sense. Instead, it was a powerful act of supreme mental self-possession, the realization that his tranquility rested solely on the choice of where he directs his attention and what internal judgments he chooses to embrace or discard at any given moment. This profound shift prepared him for a life lived under continuous scrutiny, realizing that every passing moment presented a fresh opportunity to shed an unearned assumption, thereby reclaiming true emotional liberty. The concepts of judgment and necessity had offered a strange sort of intellectual armor. The young man carried them back to his quiet room, theories that felt monumental yet fragile when faced with the weight of lived experience. He waited for a moment of true reckoning, a situation complex enough to test the limits of stoic logic. When it arrived, it was in the guise of everyday frustration, a disagreement over practical matters, or perhaps a slight miscommunication with someone he cared deeply about. His mind immediately constructed the intellectual framework: pause, analyze, strip away judgment, accept necessity. He prepared himself for calm detachment, but the feeling arrived not as a philosophical dilemma, but as raw, hot annoyance. The other person said something that on the surface was trivial, a misplaced item, an inaccurate detail, or a simple assumption that challenged his narrative of competence. The initial reaction was visceral. His internal script screamed for defense, for immediate correction, for the swift assertion of his own rightness. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the sudden rush of heat to his face, the very emotional alarm bell he had spent weeks trying to silence. It was a gut-level regression, a slip back into the habit of believing that reality should respond to his expectations. His meticulous mental defenses crumbled under the pressure of genuine human interaction. He stumbled through the argument, uttering words that lacked the precision and calm he desired. He fought against the immediate impulse to escalate, biting back the sharp retort, but the effort was exhausting. When the exchange finally cooled, leaving behind only a residue of strained silence and disappointment, he found himself alone again, surrounded by the cool anonymity of his chamber. The failure stung with the peculiar gravity reserved for intellectual failures, not merely failing an assignment, but failing at self-mastery itself. He realized that understanding stoicism in the pristine quiet of a grove was one thing. Applying it when feeling slighted or misunderstood was another entirely. His mind, though educated by philosophy, remained sluggish, weighted down by years of automatic emotional responses. The philosopher's lessons had given him tools, the pause, the separation of fact from judgment, but they had not yet installed the muscle memory required for true reliability. This failure became a harsh teacher, forcing him to recognize that simply knowing what to do was far removed from having the power to do it. The self-recrimination was immediate and sharp. He was intellectually sophisticated, but practically inept when confronted with genuine friction. He felt frustrated not by the other person's actions, but by the persistent gap between his internal philosophy and his external behavior. This grappling led him into a deeper cycle of rumination, where every minor inconvenience, the late arrival, the unexpected detour, the required agreement on a subjective matter, became fodder for painful self-analysis. He was constantly trying to test the hypothesis of tranquility against the harsh background noise of human imperfection. He found himself dwelling not just on the argument itself, but on the internal struggle it revealed. The sheer effort required merely to pause. The space between stimulus and response felt vast, a chasm he had only glimpsed before. It demanded an energy that seemed limitless. He questioned if he was simply trying to force his emotions into compliance with logic, or if genuine acceptance required a deeper restructuring of how he perceived value itself, a shift away from the belief that external harmony is necessary for internal peace. This initial failure established the crucial premise. True mastery was not about avoiding difficulty. It was about navigating unavoidable difficulty without letting it dismantle one's inner citadel. He needed to move past the mere understanding of theory and begin the relentless, daily grind of practical application. Having struggled so deeply with the abstract theories of philosophy, with notions like necessity and judgment, the sheer weight of knowing was proving almost more taxing than the struggle itself. The concepts felt vast, beautiful even, yet utterly detached from the messy reality of a simple afternoon's encounter or a fleeting moment of frustration. The knowledge gained in the olive grove was a perfect shield for contemplation, but it proved inadequate armor against the unpredictable currents of daily life. He realized that truly mastering himself did not come from understanding why he reacted, but from the sustained, muscle memory act of choosing how to react when he was tired, distracted, or faced with unexpected disappointment. The weight of this gap between theory and practice became the deepest challenge of his journey. He sought out a situation that demanded immediate application, a negotiation over passage through the city gate, or perhaps simply an exchange in a crowded public square. The stakes were minor by epic standards, yet they were precisely calibrated to test every lesson he had accumulated. His initial attempt failed with startling speed. Faced with a casual slight, a brush of shoulders, a sharp word spoken without malice, his practiced detachment wavered. The ancient mechanism he was learning was too delicate, too reliant on sustained focus. It faltered under the pressure of immediacy. The internal regression was painful. It wasn't the conflict itself that defeated him, but the memory of having to actively suppress an old, comfortable habit of indignation. He felt a familiar prickling heat rising in his chest, the automatic physiological precursor to anger. His mind screamed for the immediate release of blame, demanding he argue or retaliate. He remembered the words, pause, just a moment between the stimulus and the response, but the instant required was agonizingly short. It felt like trying to hold back a rushing river with cupped hands. He eventually found himself withdrawing slightly, taking several deep breaths that seemed disproportionately long in the middle of the bustling exchange. He did not argue. He merely observed. This pause was more than just breathing. It was an active withholding of self. In that suspension, he felt a profound exhaustion, the fatigue of constant mental resistance. The simple act of choosing stillness when every instinct screamed for reaction became a colossal expenditure of energy. The initial setback, the failure to maintain control in a spontaneous, minor conflict, served not as defeat, but as a critical piece of data. It revealed that self-mastery was not a switch one could simply flip, nor was it a destination reached after reading enough texts. Instead, it was a perpetual discipline, requiring repetition and refinement until the pause became less an act of will and more a natural state of being. The lesson thus crystallized. The true power does not lie in grand philosophical pronouncements or intellectual epiphanies. It resides in that brief, charged vacuum between sensation and reaction. It is the conscious cultivation of empty space, the pause, which gives the mind room to process judgment before acting upon it. This moment allows for a crucial intervention, shifting him from being merely reactive to being actively responsive. To seize control not over external events, which remains impossible, but over the invaluable span of time between feeling and action. The power, he understood, was in the interval. The philosopher had drawn the distinction with steady hands, painting an invisible line through the air. One side was everything that might happen to you in this life: your health, the whim of fortune, other people's choices, and the sweep of history itself. The other side was vastly smaller, yet immeasurably more powerful. It was simply your own faculty of judgment, your assent, your decision about what holds value or meaning for you. He watched the young man absorb these concepts, not with eagerness, but with the careful scrutiny of someone who has been profoundly disappointed by experience. For weeks, he had learned to separate the raw sensory fact from the narrative that immediately followed it. The moment the bird landed, the thought flashed through was that the landing meant nothing, yet his first instinct was often judgment. This is inconvenient, this is an insult, this is unfair. The philosopher continued, turning the focus inward. He asked him to consider worry itself. Where did the root of distress lie? Was it in the loss of the gold, or in the belief that the lack of gold would ruin his life and diminish his worth? The young man struggled with this inventory. It was easier to blame external forces, to point at a failing ruler or a cruel merchant, than to look into the turbulent waters of his own mind. This forced examination led to the core discipline, defining what truly belongs to him. The philosopher explained that we spend our lives worrying about things belonging to others, the reputation others hold for us, the love another person may decide not to give, the economic stability of a distant city. These things are outside his control, outside the perimeter of his will. The dichotomy was absolute. He could not command the wind to change direction, nor could he dictate the emotional state of those around him. To do so is to live in a constant, exhausting battle against necessity itself. But what remained? The thought materialized slowly, only the judgment given by his own mind. His assent or refusal to judge something as bad or as good was wholly and utterly within his grasp. He realized that every single pang of regret, every flare of misplaced anger, had been generated not by the external event itself, but by his internal decision to attach a value judgment to it. The loss was merely an occurrence. The tragedy resided in his belief that the loss constituted a fundamental flaw in his existence. The philosopher then presented this understanding as a practical challenge. He instructed him to treat every perceived loss, every setback, not as a catastrophe demanding a reaction, but simply as neutral data. A rock rolling down a hill does not judge itself. It simply follows gravity. His mind must learn that same passive acceptance of process. The weight of this realization was immense. To constantly monitor one's own ascent required an intellectual energy previously reserved for dramatic suffering. It demanded living in a state of active neutrality, where emotions were observed like passing clouds rather than forces dictating movement. This wasn't merely an abstract philosophy to be recited at dinner parties. It was the blueprint for genuine self-possession. True freedom, he began to understand, was not found in external success or comfort, but in the mastery of his own inner ascent. The philosopher challenged him further. What if even internal control is a continuous effort? What happens when the practiced detachment falters under the strain of complex emotion, the grief for something desired that will never be? The young man anticipated this return to fallibility. He knew the intellectual understanding was not enough. It had to become the bedrock of his being, a permanent habit of thought. The task became clear. He must treat these principles not as lessons learned in theory, but as tools for daily architecture, the constant rebuilding and reinforcing of the inner self. This ancient Greek discipline was nothing less than a revolution of the mind, redefining where one draws the boundary between the personal and the inevitable, transforming desperation into disciplined contemplation. The final lesson was perhaps the most challenging of all. It went beyond simply not reacting to external chaos. It demanded a complete shift in how one viewed inevitable suffering and unpredictable fortune. The philosopher guided him away from theoretical understanding and toward the harsh, beautiful immediacy of existence itself. This final threshold required accepting something profound. That life is inherently messy, unfair, and utterly indifferent to our desires. We spend so much energy fighting what is, convinced it must be different, because we are accustomed to imagining a perfect unfolding of events. But true freedom lies not in controlling the outcome, but in changing the relationship one has with the unchangeable flow of time. The concept presented was deeply radical. Amor Fati. It means to love one's fate. It is more than mere endurance or passive acceptance. It is an active embrace of everything that happens, both the pleasant and the excruciating, recognizing them all as necessary components of the self-making narrative. One must not only tolerate necessity, but actively desire it, viewing every misfortune, every stumble, every frustrating day, not as a deviation from a planned path, but as the perfect material required for one's own growth. Initially, this idea felt like a surrender, a profound laziness of the spirit. To love fate seemed to imply that resistance was futile, that striving against what simply is was pointless. The young man wrestled with the weight of this command. He felt trapped between the disciplined intellectualism he had achieved and the emotional impulse to simply push back. His inner conflict raged. If embracing suffering becomes a virtue, does that mean indifference to injustice? Is it moral weakness to wish for an easier path? He confronted the myth of perfect agency, realizing that even his will was subject to limitations far beyond his knowing. The philosopher showed him this through small acts, a journey forced into difficult terrain during unexpected weather, or a necessary interaction with someone deeply flawed whose company he previously would have rejected outright. These were not tests of mere patience, but tests of incorporation. He had been trained to observe facts and delay judgment. Now he was challenged to see the necessity in the fact itself. The philosopher suggested that viewing these events as unavoidable gifts, gifts of resistance, gifts of challenge, gifts of perspective, transformed them from burdens into raw materials for virtue. This required him to redefine his understanding of the good life. It was not a life free of hardship, nor even one optimized for personal comfort. Instead, it became a continuous performance of aligning the self with the universal law of natural cause and effect. If he accepted that this current difficulty, this specific frustration, and this inevitable loss were simply what must happen for him to become fully realized, then they lost their power to wound. They ceased to be perceived as injustices against an idealized timeline. The journey became a psychological dismantling. He started paying attention not just to the negative events, but to the structure of inevitability itself. He began asking, what would life look like if I insisted that everything must conform to my personal narrative? The answer was chaos, not external chaos, but self-imposed chaos driven by perpetual disappointment. He learned to seek the ripple effect. Every rejection, every setback, every seemingly pointless inconvenience contained a hidden thread of instructional value. They were not mistakes. They were parameters setting the boundaries of his growth. To resist them was to shrink his own potential. The struggle shifted from managing reaction, which he had largely mastered through discipline and pause, to embracing the entirety of the experience. He moved from observing what was to delighting in what must be. The concept solidified that true freedom is synonymous with radical acceptance. It is recognizing the unbreakable loop of existence, the perfect interplay of cause and effect, and aligning one's inner peace not just with what is unavoidable, but actively loving it as such. This deep-seated discipline became the framework for his remaining life, a quiet resilience drawn from the understanding that suffering is not an aberration of good times, but rather its defining architecture. He had found not a philosophy to guide him, but a fundamental way to simply exist within the current flow of being. His mastery was complete, achieved in the full heart of accepting necessity. The journey to true mastery had led him far from the clamor of the Agora. He understood now that mere acceptance of fate, or Amor Fati, was only half the battle. It meant accepting what was, but it did not guarantee inner peace in the face of continued disturbance. The greatest difficulty remained. How does one live when the world continues its natural course of unpredictability and human folly? The philosopher had guided him to the deepest stratum of this challenge. He taught him that true freedom lies not simply in loving fate, but in mastering his emotional distance from all outcomes. This was the practice of appropriate indifference. This concept was often misinterpreted as simple apathy or withdrawal, a feigned lack of caring, but it was profoundly different. It was an active mental discipline, a rigorous form of focus that demanded constant attention to where he placed his internal value judgments. The task before him was not to feel nothing. Instead, the goal was to ensure that his happiness, his tranquility, and his fundamental sense of self-worth were attached only to actions he could govern, his will, his assent, and his choices, and never to external results. This realization brought a fresh wave of intellectual panic. If pleasure depended only on choice, then the natural human condition, which is built around seeking reward and avoiding pain, suddenly felt terribly incomplete. Was life meant to be lived with such measured disinterest? To treat monumental events and minor slights with the same calculated equanimity? The philosopher watched this internal turmoil unfold, recognizing that fear of indifference was often a greater barrier than the difficulty of indifference itself. He explained that indifference here did not mean detachment from humanity or from joy. It meant emotional independence from necessity. It was understanding that people act out of their own flawed desires, and he must learn to view those actions with objective clarity, as if observing a mechanism at work. The boy began his practice by analyzing common human interactions. He watched merchants haggling over goods, realizing the deep currents beneath the frantic gestures, a mix of desperation, greed, and fragile self-esteem. He saw friends bickering over minor slights, their outrage disproportionate to the actual offense. Each scene became a lesson in calibrated detachment. He learned that most suffering was generated by an arbitrary emotional chain reaction. Someone said something, he judged it wrong, he assumed malicious intent, and then his immediate response manufactured pain out of thin air. The philosopher showed him how easily this judgment was suspended. If the remark was merely noise, a random burst of sound from a distressed throat, and not a personal attack, then its meaning evaporated. The work demanded that he create a mental space between the stimulus and his internal assessment. He would observe a situation, say, witnessing a public display of extreme arrogance or irrational panic, and instead of immediately feeling indignation or pity, he would perform a deep inventory. What is happening? What specific emotion am I allowing to attach value here? Is this my concern, or merely the passing spectacle of someone else's inner life? This was exhausting work. His instincts screamed for reaction. to feel justice demanding repayment, to feel empathy requiring action, to simply rail against the perceived injustice of random misfortune. Each attempt at cool observation resulted in a flicker of heat, a sudden, hot surge of frustration that betrayed his internal struggle. He would fall back into the comfortable gravity of expectation. I expected people to be reasonable. I expected life to have clear rules. Therefore, their failings are unacceptable. The indifference he sought was not coldness, but robustness. It was a mental armor constructed from sheer observation. It was realizing that while his judgment could be controlled by him alone, the reality of the world remained wild, unpredictable, and fundamentally indifferent to his personal desires for harmony. He began to redefine what success meant. Success was no longer achieving some ideal state of external peace. It was simply maintaining the internal quietude regardless of the chaos surrounding him. It was treating every emotional spike, be it disappointment over failure or frustration with others' lack of wisdom, as merely passing air, acknowledged but given no purchase on his core stability. The habit became systemic. He stopped waiting for grand philosophical breakthroughs and started finding the pattern in the mundane, noticing the slight annoyance when a cart blocked his path, tolerating the tedious conversation while eating bread, accepting the persistent drizzle despite having traveled to avoid rain. Each of these tiny acts of measured non-reaction was a victory, proving that true strength lay not in mastering oneself for grand moral gestures, but in simply refusing to be derailed by the relentless current of ordinary life. The habit of indifference, when done properly and with purpose, was therefore nothing less than radical self-possession, a state where one's inner core remains inviolable, regardless of how much external force is arrayed against it. The journey had not ended in quiet contemplation. Having learned to accept fate and to establish a rigorous distance from external desires, the time came for the test. The philosopher had prepared him, but nothing could truly replicate the unpredictable surge of humanity. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his back on the tranquility of the olive grove and re-entered the pulsating heart of the city, the echo of that original, chaotic agora. The first moments were a profound exercise in suspension. He walked through the throng, past stalls laden with brightly colored goods, past shouting vendors whose cries seemed to pierce the air itself. The noise was immense, assaulting the senses, a cacophony that had once triggered instant panic and overwhelming self-disappointment. Yet this time there was no flinching gut reaction. There was only presence. He noticed his focus was fundamentally different. Where before his mind latched onto every discord, the raised voice, the carelessly spilled goods, the hasty shoving of bodies, now it treated them as mere data points. The sounds were simply pitches. The smells were merely combinations of spices and sweat. He was a quiet observer in a festival of raw existence. The weight of decades of philosophical training settled upon his spirit. He walked with an inner equilibrium, understanding that this chaos did not exist to assail him, but simply existed. It demanded nothing of him except recognition. He passed groups of people locked in petty squabbles, gestures too large for the occasion, words exchanged with dramatic venom over trivial perceived slights. Instinctively, his old self would have judged them, labeled them as fools or morally deficient. Instead, he simply observed the physics of their interaction, two individuals occupying space and projecting conflicting narratives onto one another. They were trapped in the immediacy of their own judgments. This internal change was more challenging than any single lecture on ascent could be. It required not just knowing what to think, but remembering how not to feel. He faced minor humiliations, being jostled by a cart, having his path blocked by an oblivious merchant, and yet the protective layer of reasoned detachment held firm. The impulse to curse, to complain, or even to internally resent the inconvenience was always there, a low hum beneath the surface, but he consciously allowed it to pass like a passing cloud. The profound difference lay in his interior landscape. Before, the external world acted as an indiscriminate catalyst, setting off an emotional chain reaction within him, a spark of annoyance leading to frustration, which escalated into despair or rage. Now, the outside noise was simply background radiation. The core of his self-worth and peace remained untouched, protected by the discipline of detachment. He stopped near a fountain, watching the flow of people gather at its edge. He watched a young woman arguing animatedly with her companion about something inconsequential, a price, perhaps, or a perceived slight from a neighbor. The tension in their posture was palpable. The argument was a performance rooted in wounded ego. He remembered the painful lesson of separating fact from judgment. The facts were: two people standing near water, speaking loudly and gesticulating wildly. The judgments were all the rest: that one person was wrong, that the other was foolish, or that their relationship should be flawless and harmonious. He recognized that he had not merely learned a philosophical theory. He had acquired an architectural blueprint for his soul, capable of withstanding tremors and noise. The old habits did fight back. When a vendor shouted aggressively at another patron, seemingly out of rage, the ingrained habit was to recoil into judgment. This person is cruel. But his trained mind intercepted that thought. It merely processed the sound, a loud, forceful vibration intended for sale, and filed it away as an external event devoid of personal significance. This re-entry into chaos became less a dramatic victory and more a quiet, persistent accumulation of small triumphs. Each minute spent without reacting to inconvenience was a testament to sustained mastery. He realized that true freedom was not found in the absence of difficulty or noise, but in cultivating the capacity to receive those things without suffering. The world continued its relentless rhythm. The shouts never ceased, and the minor slights were constant. Yet, where once they had pierced him like shards of glass, they now seemed merely textured parts of a grand, messy tapestry. He was no longer seeking perfection or predictability in the outer world. He was simply accepting it as it flowed, a natural, necessary state of affairs. This profound habit, this sustained effort to govern one's internal ascent rather than reacting to external stimuli, proved itself not merely intellectual exercise, but a radical and life-sustaining pillar of human existence. It was the blueprint for resilient citizenship, recognizing that while we cannot control the actions or the pronouncements of others, we retain absolute sovereignty over the citadel of our own minds. And in that small pocket of self-control, he found everything he needed to redefine what it meant to be free. The streets of the Agora had changed for him. The sheer volume of life remained, the shouted prices, the clatter of pottery, the mingling sense of spice and sweat. But his perception of it was fundamentally altered. He moved through the crowd with a quiet economy of motion, no longer seeing mere noise, but complex patterns of human energy. Where once he felt an acute sense of personal siege, now there was only observation. His attention shifted away from what the chaos demanded of him, and toward simply recording what was present. He watched a vendor arranging fruit on a low table. Instead of judging the arrangement as poor or the seller's cry as irritating, he registered the hues. The deep violet skin of plums, the luminous gold of peaches, the rough texture of the woven mat beneath them. He noted the systematic repetition of the process, the careful placement, the slight adjustment, the geometry of commerce. His mind worked like a meticulous scribe, recording sensory data without passing judgment upon its worth or its meaning. It was an intellectual exercise in neutrality. A child darted past him, laughing loudly. The old self would have registered this as disruption, a momentary annoyance that demanded a reaction, perhaps an irritated glance or a muttered correction. But now his observation was clinical. He simply noted the movement, small form, swift passage, sound characterized by high pitch and sudden cadence. No associated narrative of inappropriate behavior intervened. The laughter was just vibration, the running child merely kinetic energy. The deepest shift occurred when he observed people interacting. Before his training, every exchange, a quick quarrel over a price, an overly familiar touch, a polite dismissal, had triggered an immediate internal response. Defensiveness, anger, or hurt. He remembered the searing heat of those emotional flares, the way they had consumed moments and reputations alike. Now, he saw interaction purely as dialogue, a sequence of uttered sounds attempting to convey intent, overlaid upon gesture. He noticed that arguments were rarely about the actual subject matter. Often, they revolved around subtle power dynamics, wounded pride, or misaligned expectations, the fragile architecture built on unstated demands. He began to perceive these social interactions less like intense personal confrontations and more like poorly written plays, where characters were merely performing roles dictated by ingrained habit. The true marvel of this new vision was the capacity for deep pattern recognition. The noise that used to overwhelm him now provided a rich data set. He started seeing how merchants inevitably positioned themselves near sources of high-foot traffic, understanding not malice but simple geometry and necessity. He saw patterns in the crowds, the way people clustered around an obvious source of food or novelty, the predictable paths worn into the cobblestones by routine footsteps. The drama he had once felt was revealed to be nothing more than highly visible predictability. This systematic observation refined his understanding of judgment itself. Judgment, he realized, was not merely a feeling. It was an act of imposing meaning that often distorted simple reality. When his mind habitually leaped from a sensory input, a sudden drop in the crowd's murmuring, to a conclusion, meaning this means trouble is coming, he would now intercept the leap. He trained himself to simply accept the lack of noise, noting only the absence of sound waves, stripping away the dramatic narrative of impending disaster. The goal was not profound philosophical insight, though that followed naturally. The immediate aim was pure descriptive fidelity. To become a flawless recorder of external reality, unburdened by internal expectation or emotional coloring. He was learning to live in a state of profound mental spaciousness, allowing unfiltered data streams, the glint off a bronze shield, the specific cadence of a street musician's lyre, the pattern of dust settling on an unused amphora, to simply wash over his awareness without resistance. The chaos remained loud, unpredictable, and ceaseless. But for the first time in his life, he realized that by withdrawing his internal participation, by refusing to assent to the dramatic meaning he was forced to assign to everything, he had found a silent dominion within himself. He was no longer merely existing in the world. He was observing it from a detached center, seeing patterns where others only saw momentary drama. The noise of the Agora had once been a torment, an assaulting wall of sound and expectation. It was a place designed for drama, for outburst, for immediate reaction. But now, that same space felt transformed by quiet discipline. The man walked through the market streets, no longer viewing them as sources of personal attack, but as complex systems of observable behavior. The sensory overload remained. The shouts of merchants, the clanging of metal, the press of bodies, yet they held no power over him. He moved with a serene, almost unnerving tranquility. His mind operated like a finely tuned instrument, perpetually engaged in observation. When another man bumped into him carelessly, an old instinct might have sparked resentment, or at least a brief flicker of annoyance. But the trained habit intervened. He did not react to the slight, he simply observed the physical event, the point of contact, the direction of movement, the resulting readjustment of weight. The action was neutral data. This discipline had been forged through weeks of arduous mental training, a slow and relentless reshaping of self. It was more than just patience. It was an active cognitive stance. He understood that his comfort did not depend on the world behaving reasonably, but only on his mind refusing to cooperate with unrealistic expectations. One afternoon, while observing a dispute over weights and measures, he watched two men escalate their disagreement. The shouting built quickly, fueled by mutual accusation and wounded pride. It was the familiar cycle of flawed human interaction, a storm of emotional necessity. He remembered the philosopher's lessons. Where do these outbursts originate? They spring not from the disputed goods, but from the internal stories each man tells himself about being wronged, misunderstood, or undervalued. He saw a young vendor stumble and drop his basket of fruit. The noise momentarily stilled in their immediate vicinity as gasps of surprise followed. A ripple of mild pity passed through the crowd. But then, another man scoffed loudly at the mess, injecting a harsh judgment into the momentary pause. The initial, natural response for most people would be to join the chorus, to laugh, or to complain about the clumsiness of the vendor. But he paused. He felt the internal tug toward judgment, the urge to critique the snickerer, to silently correct the crowd's lack of grace. Instead, he performed the conscious act of separation. The man had dropped fruit, that was the fact. His judgment that the mess was embarrassing, that was the story. And those two elements were vastly separated within his consciousness. The mastery of this inner life was not a singular triumph. It was a consistent habit. It required him to cultivate a constant state of readiness, like an athlete perpetually poised for action, but never reacting unless absolutely necessary. This rigorous self-monitoring taught him the true meaning of freedom, the ability to remain unswayed by the unpredictable turbulence of other people's expectations or emotional dramas. And then came a moment of true testing. He encountered a man, a boisterous, charismatic fellow who seemed determined to provoke conversation and disagreement merely for sport. This individual approached him near a fountain, his eyes twinkling with an almost predatory amusement. The air grew thick with subtle challenge. The stranger spoke first, not attacking a fact or a deed, but challenging the quiet composure he wore like a second skin. The words were layered, half compliment, half subtle dismissal, a performance designed to elicit defensiveness or surprise. It was the kind of interaction that used to send his emotions spinning into frantic defense mechanisms. The old him would have bristled instantly, formulating a sharp retort, needing to prove his self-worth in the exchange. But today, he simply allowed the words to wash over him, like rain on hot stone. He listened not for insult, but for the raw structure of the speech. He noted the tone, the gesture, the rhetorical puffery, treating the entire exchange as a piece of anthropological study. The stranger paused, expecting some sign of struggle, a flicker of annoyance that confirmed his successful provocation. But the man only offered a measured gaze, an internal silence that was more powerful than any rebuttal. He spoke finally, not with passion or defense, but with crystalline clarity. He did not argue the points raised by the stranger. Instead, he gently questioned the structure of judgment itself. He suggested, simply and calmly, that perhaps the pleasure derived from a witty exchange lay not in the wisdom exchanged, but in the predictable power dynamic inherent in who speaks first, and who is momentarily silenced afterward. The words were simple, stripped bare of rhetorical flourish or emotional heat, yet they carried the weight of profound understanding. They addressed the mechanics of interaction rather than the content of it. The boisterous man's confident mask faltered. His eyes widened slightly. He seemed caught in a momentary silence, an unexpected vacuum where sharp wit had been anticipated. He was momentarily speechless, struck not by anger, but by the sheer calm competence of the response. The exchange, designed for dramatic effect, ended abruptly on a note of profound and unsettling respect. The passing moment confirmed everything. The ultimate power was not in the tongue's ability to cut or persuade, but in the mind's disciplined refusal to participate in unnecessary drama. This steady inner state, this hard-won composure, was more valuable than any dazzling retort. It was a self that could withstand the slings and arrows of circumstance, unmoved by external force. The true epiphany resonated through him. This peace was not found in some remote sanctuary or achieved through luck. It was a habit, a daily, exhausting commitment to self-governance. To choose consistently, over years of practice, to pause between stimulus and judgment. This deep mental discipline, this sustained effort to keep the inner dialogue honest, recognizing only what is within one's own assent, was the greatest change he could ever bring about, not just for himself, but for the way humanity might approach its own relentless chaos. It was a framework of thought, an inherited wisdom capable of reshaping souls, and perhaps, eventually, even the city itself. The boy found that the quiet mastery of self was not merely a personal achievement. It represented something far larger. As he stood amidst the controlled chaos of the Agora, observing the ebb and flow of human interaction, a new truth settled upon him. This discipline of relentless inner monitoring was an inherited framework, a blueprint for a life lived in accordance with reason itself. It was not simply about escaping frustration or gaining composure during a minor slight. It was about adopting a way of perceiving existence that transcended the mere self. He began to see that every decision, every moment of deep contemplation, carried an echo back through time. The profound detachment he had achieved, the ability to strip away judgment and simply observe raw data, the crimson stain of dye on linen, the rhythmic call of a street vendor, the sudden arc of spilled fruit. This was not a modern invention. It was a perennial human struggle, refined over millennia by minds that dared to ask fundamental questions about how one ought to live. The weight of this realization brought a deep sense of responsibility. He understood that the techniques he had practiced, the pausing between stimulus and response, the radical acceptance of fate, the disciplined separation of what was within his control from what lay beyond it, were not isolated tips for personal improvement. They were pillars of an intellectual tradition, a shared legacy of thought meant to guide humanity away from self-destructive emotional volatility. The ancient Greeks had established this path, that true freedom is found only when the mind refuses to assent to false assumptions about how reality ought to function. To live thoughtfully was, therefore, less a personal virtue and more a civic duty. It demanded an active participation in the slow, arduous work of reshaping one's own internal constitution. He recalled the sheer passion and vibrant disorder of the marketplace, and now he saw it with entirely new eyes. The vendors still shouted their wares, the merchants still haggled over prices, The crowd still moved like a restless river. But where before his attention had latched onto points of conflict, a misplaced word, an aggressive gesture, now his gaze simply catalogued detail. He perceived the patterns, the tired slump in a man's shoulders speaking of labor, the quick, hopeful glance of a child watching coins drop into a trough, the subtle exchange of goods that communicated far more than mere currency. This new form of sight was exhausting yet profoundly liberating. It required constant effort to resist the ingrained impulse toward narrative, the need to assign blame, tragedy, or meaning. To see simply what is, without layering judgment upon it, was an act of intellectual discipline bordering on meditative art. He realized that civilization itself runs not on grand laws etched in stone, but on this subtler, continuous practice, the disciplined agreement to accept necessity and to choose reason over immediate impulse. His understanding expanded beyond mere personal emotional management. He grasped that when enough individuals adopted this habit of inquiry, this commitment to pausing before reacting, accepting what they could not change, and rigorously defining their own boundaries of assent, the cumulative effect would ripple outwards. It would temper the volatility of the city. It would encourage dialogue based on shared observation rather than wounded ego. It would shift political discourse from vengeful accusation to sober analysis. The inheritance was clear. Western thought itself had been shaped by this rigorous focus on internal life. The questions posed in the quiet grove, the emphasis on self-examination over divine decree, the belief that a man could become virtuous through sheer intellectual effort. These were revolutionary ideas born from the conviction that mastery of self was the prerequisite for mastering one's community. The journey back to the noise of humanity brought him not fear, but profound calm. He walked deeper into the flow of people, no longer an outsider overwhelmed by sensory assault, but a disciplined observer integrating himself into the continuous hum of existence. His internal state had stabilized to such a degree that external events simply ceased to register as threats or grievances. They became neutral facts, background data for his ongoing intellectual experiment with being. This systematic self-monitoring was not merely coping, it was building an unshakable citadel within the shifting sands of life. The years unfolded into a rhythm of return. The marketplace was no longer a source of shock and dismay. It was simply the ground upon which life occurred. He stood now in a modern thoroughfare, amidst the rush and relentless current of humanity. The subway roared by, a metal beast carrying countless lives toward unseen destinations. This setting felt exponentially more overwhelming than the ancient Agora, yet his inner response had fundamentally changed. The former sensitivity to noise and frenzy had cooled into something resilient, like deep river stone. He observed the stream of faces, hurried glances, burdened shoulders, silent dramas unfolding in proximity. They were engaged in their own personal sagas, tales of missed connections, overdue debts, or merely the fatigue of a long day. He recognized them not as tragedies or triumphs, but simply data points. The old man's teachings had been so rigorous, so demanding of constant presence. The life he was now living required an indefinite maintenance of that attention. It was exhausting in a way that pure physical labor never could be. To maintain this internal stillness meant constantly arguing with the loudest parts of his own mind. The voice that insisted on meaning, the habit that demanded justice, the expectation that everything must make sense. He remembered the exquisite struggle to differentiate fact from judgment. The subway car braked suddenly. The sudden jolt was a raw physical stimulus. His internal script, honed by years of philosophical training, instantly questioned. I should have stood closer to the pillar. This was not a true thought. It was an old story demanding a culprit. He dismissed it with practiced ease. The feeling of near impact was merely physics meeting biology, the profound realization that had crystallized in those quiet olive groves and then been tested against the cacophony of daily life was this. Nearly all human suffering is not caused by external failure, but by internal insistence. We do not suffer because things happen. We suffer because we attach value to how they should have happened. The wisdom he gained had forced him into a position of ultimate neutrality. He saw the man arguing loudly on his phone call about perceived injustice. He did not feel the historical urge to interject, to offer a corrective truth, or to suggest a more reasoned course. The argument was simply sound waves colliding with emotional voltage. Another woman dropped her groceries. The resultant scatter of fruit and bread was handled with efficiency, but without any accompanying fanfare of lamentation or judgment. It was just physics, requiring nothing more than effort to clean up. The concept of appropriate indifference remained his ultimate shield. This was not the surrender of care, nor the coldness of apathy. It was a sophisticated mental positioning, accepting reality as it is in this precise moment, thereby making one's inner state immune to the momentary whims and inevitable friction of others. He understood that true freedom meant disconnecting personal well-being from predicted outer harmony. This realization allowed him to move through crowds with an unshakable gravity. Where once he had feared the unpredictable nature of existence, the sudden loss, the unexpected slight, the meaningless failure, he now saw only texture. Life was not a play written for him. It was merely a continuous, imperfect flow of sensory data. This quiet endurance became his most profound contribution. He realized that the disciplined application of this ancient Greek habit of relentless self-interrogation and immediate assent control did more than simply grant personal peace. It offered an intellectual framework capable of tempering the inevitable volatility inherent in human civilization. This habit, he understood, was not a mere philosophical theory to be recited during quiet contemplation. It was a practical, moment-by-moment discipline that could redefine the very quality of interaction within society. The passage of time had refined his understanding. Resilience is achieved not by eliminating difficulty, but by developing an unshakable, systematic method for processing reality. The knowledge he held now felt less like wisdom acquired and more like fundamental physics, an unavoidable law governing inner life. He carried this equilibrium with him, a silent testimony that mastery was possible, even in the face of modern disorder. The greatest luxury, he concluded, was not comfort or ease, but the relentless self-possession achieved by paying attention to one's own assent. To simply observe the world without adding the weight of narrative expectation. This quiet vigilance became the cornerstone of a life profoundly changed, allowing him to carry the deep,